Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author but also director of the centre.
And I'm Jacob Renneker. I'm a fantasy scholar, enthusiast, and I work in creating fantasy board games and trading card games.
And today, in honour of the arrival of the Year of the Rabbit on the 22nd of January, Jacob and I are devoting this programme to discussing the role of rabbits in fantasy. Now, the first thing, Jacob, I came across when I looked into this is the big difference between the hare and the rabbit. That would be another program. But I think one of the reasons for this is that in terms of UK mythology, rabbits are actually a fairly new arrival. One story is that they came over with the Normans, and the second is that they came over before that with the Romans. So we're very much regarded as a food source. They had warrens which they managed, and obviously rabbit fur was used in cloaks and all that kind of thing. So they're a relatively new arrival in terms of the UK. So I reckon that's why they've missed out on a mythological status. So Jacob, what were your first thoughts when you came to thinking about rabbits in fantasy?
Yeah, I was immediately hit with the same issue and looking through the different familiar fantasy images that I had in my mind of what I just figured all were rabbits, and turns out they weren't. That is not technically the case. And so yeah, I had a kind of a crash course in um, uh, what is it? Lapid? Is that the technical name? Whatever their technical.
Latin. You're taking us down the Latin route. Yeah.
Yeah, for genus and species purposes, I had a crash course in hares versus rabbits, and I think that one of the reasons that that you said was that rabbits are fairly newcomers to the UK, and with hares, and I think also socially from my education this past week or so on rabbits. I'm by no means an expert, but that hares generally are more independent and only associate in groups of maybe one or two, whereas rabbits have warrens, and so there's different types of behavior associated socially, and so that fits. And I think with some of the stories that we'll talk about today, that
Yeah.
certainly fits well with the technical rabbits versus the hares that I was having to kind of filter out of this conversation, who do definitely come across as more independent, functioning on their own. Yeah.
And the other thing about hares, of course, is they get all the exciting stuff of, as mad as a March hare, to them, whereas there's definitely a coziness to rabbits, which I don't know if in the Chinese culture, which is obviously incorporated it very importantly as part of their their zodiac, their cosmology, whether or not the same associations are true over there. But anyway, let's think about rabbits in fantasy. And the first place we're going to stop, because we are the Oxford Centre, is with potentially the most famous fantasy rabbit. That is the White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, who is always late with his pocket watch. And he is the one who is actually the call to adventure for Alice, and of course follows him down the rabbit hole. So what do you think about the qualities of the White Rabbit and its role in that story? What use has Lewis Carroll made of our friendly garden creature in that case?
Yeah, with the White Rabbit, I thought it was interesting that Carol uses both a rabbit and a hare, right? And I'm sure that that's
Yeah.
intentional, that particular difference. In terms of the rabbit itself, you certainly have a sense, and it's hard to talk about the White Rabbit in my mind without talking about the hare as well. So I'll mention in passing the hare, or just for the purposes of comparison. So with the rabbit, yeah, it seems to be more anxious and more tightly wound, which perhaps is mirrored in its pocket watch, right?
Mm.
Its personality versus the hare, who is not tightly wound, right? Or is a different type of winding. And so the rabbit, yes, is constantly, his character kind of seems to be anxious, and serves the function of a herald, really, right, for the king and queen of hearts. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it's interesting that is the portal into this world, was this character who is the herald of the monarchs for this larger area, or one of the larger areas that she is kind of inducted to.
Yes, and usually one of the reasons why in Lewis Carroll is, there is somebody with a rabbit in his real life, and he puts it into his book. There's a lot of in jokes and coding that goes on, but extrapolating from that, I think the rabbit is, I think what he's actually picking up is, if you actually watch a rabbit, they have that kind of twitchy nose that they're hardly still. And I think there's an element of the anxious bureaucrat, the person who is serving a termagant, really, isn't, it's a difficult, no wonder he's so worried that he's going to be late. So, and also he's constantly running on ahead. So there's that sense of restless, and he is the fidgety side. So I think that's a very good way, because as you say, a lot of the other characters Alice meets are a hare, but people like the caterpillar and the Cheshire Cat, they're all quite zoned out. And that energy is a good one to actually start an adventure. Okay, so that's, the lovely white rabbit. We'll leave him where he is, running around Wonderland. And I suppose the next most famous stop in fantasy literature for me is Beatrix Potter. And here I will bring evidence number one, which this sits on my mantelpiece. It's actually a money box. But of course, it's one of Beatrix Potter's rabbits. There are a number of them. We have obviously the Flopsy bunnies, Benjamin Bunny, sorry,
Yeah.
and Peter Rabbit. So clearly, in the world of Beatrix Potter, rabbits are absolutely central, where you get that association of the cuteness of rabbits and also the family of rabbits. It's one of the illustrations I remember best. The Peter Rabbit story is the mother rabbit with all her little baby rabbits, and then she's sort of pushing Peter Rabbit into a jacket. It looks a bit small for him, which I think many children have experienced that. So there's an association between sort of children and the rabbit family, and it's all quite, and it's the family pet. There's a sense of many people would have had as kids family pets. So there's that coziness. But what happens in the story? It's actually a bit like Bambi, or one of those things where a child is suddenly confronted with the chance of death in Mr. McGregor's garden. So it's got that darker side. And isn't his father, if I remember correctly, you've got younger children than me, but I seem to remember his father's already ended up in a pie.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it is a dark world. And Beatrix Potter was not sentimental, even though her pictures are very sweet and beautiful. There is always this memory of nature read in tooth and claw. Thank you, Tennyson, for that wonderful phrase. In her world of rabbits, do you have a favorite Beatrix Potter rabbit? Is
I think Peter, yeah, Peter's the iconic, and I brought mine again. So I have a almost 3-year-old, and so he has his Peter Rabbit with his jacket, which is a little short, and another little figure there that actually tells stories. This is, I know we'll be talking about tips later, but for those of you with children and who appreciate stories, but you don't always like reading them stories or the same stories, there's this wonderful little device called a Tony box, Tonie box, and they have these little figures, and coded to the figures are stories. So so you can have a narrator recite to your child story of Peter Rabbit, so you don't have to all the time keep it busy.
Well, I do
but that's part
know
of
what
the
you
fun.
mean though. When you've said it, you've read them a news story, and they actually week 6 times. I can see it having a role.
It's a nice, and they can do it on their own, right? So it's great entertainment anyway. So it's available. Peter Rabbit can be in your child's ear as constantly as they want if you have other things that you need to be getting onto. That's just so parenting as well as a story tip regarding Peter Rabbit. So yeah, so that one for Peter, it's iconic, and I think I was thinking through. I was actually looked to some of the early reviews of Peter Rabbit and some critical responses, and one of the kind of trends that I noted was that this was Potter kind of created a new form of animal fable where the anthropomorphic animals behaved as real animals that had true instincts, like you were saying, Julia, with like nature red in tooth and claw. So you have animals acting more like animals than just humans, anthropomorphized animals in a medieval setting or in a whatever, acting as humans. This was kind of more of an attempt to give them an actual animal flavor with the animal fable. And I think another critic noted that with the illustrations, especially, right, that these were anatomically correct animals. They spoke, but they have the proportions of rabbits, right, and the other animals there that are speaking. So, and then I like this phrase. It was the perfect marriage of word and image. And a triumph of fantasy and fact. So you have these blending of the natural world that we experience and this fantasy world kind of woven together in a unique way there. So yeah, Peter for me, and something that I came across, this was several months ago, that when you mentioned rabbits, it was one of the first things that came to mind. Again, as a tie to the Oxford Center for Fantasy, is C.S. Lewis. I came across a C.S. Lewis quote where he's talking about Peter Rabbit when he's in Preface to Paradise Lost, when he's discussing Milton. Yeah, are you ready for this? Yeah, so this is
great.
I remember being
Mashed up here. Milton, Beatrix Potter.
Right. So what Lewis was doing is he was addressing in Preface to Paradise Lost one of his predecessors at Magdalen College had written something about the great moral message of Milton in Paradise Lost is the most universal and useful, which was that obedience makes people happy and disobedience makes people miserable. So they said that that's what the big, large scale, that's kind of what the message is of Paradise Lost. There was a contemporary critic to Lewis who kind of was poking at this particular statement, and they said that this amazed him because it was a vague statement. They felt that this moral of Paradise Lost was kind of vague. So this was Lewis's response was, and I have it quoted here. Would you like the quote, or do you want to paraphrase?
Yeah, go for it.
Which would you prefer? Go for the quote.
No,
okay.
Go for it.
All right. So he says, responding to this critic who called that, reading of Paradise Lost as vague, Lewis says, dull. It amazed him because dull, if you will, or platitudinous, or harsh, or jejune, but how vague. Has it not rather the desolating clarity and concreteness of certain classic utterances we remember from the morning of our own lives? Go to bed, write out, I must do as I am told 100 times, or do not speak with your mouth full. How are we to account for the fact that great modern scholars have missed this so dazzlingly simple? It is, after all, the commonest of themes. Even Peter Rabbit came to grief because he would go into Mr. McGregor's garden. So you have this tie of the Garden of Eden in Paradise Lost and Mr. McGregor's garden that Peter Rabbit is in, and saying that the message that Lewis is drawing in here is that obedience to his mother, Mrs. Rabbit, to stay out of the garden, to do not go into Mr. McGregor's garden, right? That is met with consequences of misery for Peter because of disobedience. That was that moral message, and essentially he saw that functioning in the same moral sphere as Paradise Lost. So for Lewis, for C.S. Lewis, he plays, can switch gears between Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit and John Milton, right? And so I think most people and scholars wouldn't necessarily make that sort of connection, but that's something that fascinates me about Lewis, is how he's able to put these stories into conversation with each other, and the sort of interesting results that you get when you take seriously children's literature and compare it to any other literature.
So this give me three thoughts, Jacob. The first is I do hope a doctorate on the Miltonic echoes in Beatrix Potter. That would be great. Second thing is that there's a difference here between allegory and applicability, the old sort of Tolkien and Lewis conversation, which is that the medieval use of animals like the Parliament of Fowls and things was allegorical. And what Beatrix Potter is, so you could apply Peter going into Mr. McGregor's garden as a Garden of Eden echo. It's applicable, but it's obviously not an allegory of that, because it's just not. It's not a one-on-one fit that you would expect of an allegory. Thought, which moves us on from Beatrix Potter to C.S. Lewis himself, is that raising the Narnia treatment of animals and putting them alongside Beatrix Potter, you can see that is where I think Lewis is coming from. So his Reepicheep, for example, feels like a kind of swashbuckling Beatrix Potter character in many ways. So I'm not sure she's the only Victorian doing this, or Edwardian, but it does feel as though Narnia and the world of talking animals wouldn't exist without Beatrix Potter. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, he talks about three specific instances in his early life where he had this feeling of quote joy, this kind of sharp, distinctive sense that he describes as joy. And one of those three, one was the little toy garden that he had, kind of this world in miniature. The other was the poem by Longfellow, the saga of King Olaf. And then the third of these was the idea of autumn in the Tale of Squirrel Nutkin by Beatrix Potter. So that was
yes.
one of his specific instances that were kind of set him on his quest for joy in life, was this experience with a Beatrix Potter book. So he was very tied to this Beatrix Potter. He said, I think often when he was sick, he would read Beatrix Potter, even as an adult. Like when he had the flu and he would laid up in bed, he would always return to Beatrix Potter. And he even tried, made a pilgrimage out, but unfortunately was not able to meet Beatrix Potter.
You can today.
Yeah,
you can today. If your people are listening to this and come to the UK, you can actually stand on the beach at Keswick and look at the picture of all the squirrels on sort of paddling over to the island. You get exactly that view. It was such a brilliant, as well as her animal pictures, she captured the real places. She wasn't creating a fantasy world in that sense. It was very often the garden, the Lake District, and others. Wonderful stuff. So that reminded me of Boxen and the creation of Boxen with his brother, which of course was that not an animal world, an animal kingdom as well, of sorts?
Exactly. Yeah. Right. No, it was. And they had separate lands. You did have a rabbit land. They had these kind of different apportioned kingdoms, and so they did have a specific rabbit land and rabbit characters in Boxen, but this was different. So so clearly influenced by their interest, the Lewis children's interest in Beatrix Potter. But theirs was kind of the just animals set in, medieval society, didn't necessarily act as animals. But certainly you see influence there, and yeah, and you do have differences. I don't know if this is a good time to, if you want to take a side quest into Narnia, a brief side quest for rabbits.
It's not a side quest, because is it not the animal, the Christmas party that gets turned to stone? Don't they have rabbits sitting at the table?
Right. Yeah.
Is that
There's two others.
Oh, okay.
One of them is in The Horse and His Boy. Shasta gets, when there's the impending attack on Arkenland. Shasta gets, there's a group of rabbits that he has spread the word that the attack is coming. So you have rabbits specifically there as, again, kind of heralds, as you did in Lewis Carroll. And then in the last battle, this is interesting for Lewis's world building within Narnia. There's different types of animal creatures and sentience or moral action possible in animals. So this was so you had Jill. You have the section here that says Jill had succeeded in shooting a rabbit, and then parenthetically, not a talking rabbit, of course. There are lots of ordinary kind about in Western Narnia, end parentheses, and it was already skinned, cleaned, and hanging up. So so you have these kind of like sentient rabbits that can talk, and then these non-sentient rabbits that you're okay to eat and skin. So there's a differentiation, kind of a hierarchy, even within each animal grouping, which is really interesting. I don't know if that was just because, if this was, kind of a last story, if he's kind of like thinking this through on his feet, right? So he wasn't as meticulous of a world builder as Tolkien was, right, by any stretch of the word. But no. I wonder if this is kind of him thinking through, okay, how do animals, carnivorous animals in Narnia, what do they eat? And are they eating other kind of these sentient creatures that we've come to know and love? Or is there another way possible? So this seems to be kind of a foray into a bit of world building kind of differentiation that I don't see done quite carefully in Narnia, because that's not what Lewis's purpose is. But I do see kind of a nod towards kind of a thinking through of how this world functions with speaking animals and the possibility of non-speaking animals in that world.
Don't you think it's also terribly practical? Many children of that era, and probably even today, experience of there are some animals on the small holding and are pets, and there are some that you don't name because you might end up eating them. And you wouldn't, I can imagine that's having come through the war and with the evacuees staying up at the kilns and what have you, no doubt they would have looked for opportunities to have off-ration protein. So you don't want to name them Benjamin Bunny.
Your meal.
And then, so I can see in a talkie hearing a sort of practical solution into Narnia there. Okay. We've sort of gone to Narnia, but before we come up to close to the present time, the famous rabbit is Rabbit in Winnie the Pooh. Obviously, this is a rabbit who's based on a soft toy, as are most of the creatures in that rather eclectic group that around Winnie the Pooh. But Rabbit there is perhaps unlike the other rabbits that we've met, in that he is a kind of good friend, sound person, not silly or scatty. He's a sort of as serious as Owl, but just a good sort. I think he's also most famous in the story where Winnie the Pooh comes from tea and gets stuck, doesn't he, in the window because he's eaten too much, and so Rabbit just goes around the back and oh well, or the door, or whatever it is, the hole to get into the house. So that seems to be playing a little bit against type, in that so far have been the twitchy, go into the garden and get eaten. He seems to be a different kind of creature.
Yeah, yeah, Rabbit comes across, yeah, less as kind of a scattered, and more of a clever, but in the wrong kind, a kind of an incompetent, cleverness in sense because, he has a few different plans. He doesn't like change, right? And so when, Kanga comes in, he's very uncomfortable with new additions to their group, right? So he has this elaborate plan to scare Kanga away by hiding Rue, and trying to create an issue where Kanga would want to leave.
Yeah.
And he also has a plan to unbounce Tigger, that doesn't end up working out. He's the one, like he seems to be the practical organizer, right? Where he tries to take the lead with the group, but never quite manages. And he sees himself as the one that Christopher can depend on. So
Yeah.
you have this kind of hubris of his own plans, and kind of, yeah, I do see the anxiety, a bit similar to the White Rabbit, more emphasized in the Disney cartoon adaptation. He does come across more as an anxious kind of a control freak, right? I don't get that sense as much in the book itself, but in the cartoon, definitely he's kind of a worrywart, right? With a short temper, who just really is kind of agitated. So he seems more rabbitish in in the Disney adaptation. And what's interesting, I think, there is that you'll see, at least in that adaptation, Rabbit is kind of placed as a foil for Tigger. So you have Rabbit as kind of order and Tigger as chaos, right? So you have these two kind of like
Ah,
archetypal
okay.
images that keep like butting up against each other. That's a ready-made source of conflict, for within the Hundred Acre Wood. So I thought that was a interesting adaptation that actually works from a storytelling perspective, is kind of leaning into some of those tendencies, within those characters.
And I think now we need to go to I suppose it's the pièce de résistance for Rabbit in fantasy, which is the wonderful Watership Down, which I think shows us it blows all the rest out of the water in a sense. It shows us a completely different way of doing a animal-based fantasy story. I grew up at the time when the cartoon came out, the absolutely terrifying but very memorable adaptation with the famous Bright Eyes soundtrack, which I think went to #1 for many weeks when it was around. And there he's dealing with myxomatosis, and imagining what it's like to live in these sort of commune style um, rabbit warrens with different groups, being moved on, being moved out, being killed. And again, you've got this line taking a different approach, obviously, to Beatrix Potter, but you've got rabbit behavior interpreted through a sort of human anthropomorphic lens, but they aren't people. They are relationships between the characters are perceived more on a human level than one presumes a rabbit level. So did you read it? Have you seen the film? How did you come across Watership Down?
Yeah, my first encounter was with the film, which was, I think that some of the most memorable that kind of felt similar were, the Rats of Nim,
Yeah,
cartoon, the
yeah.
Don Bluth film. They came out, I think, around the same time, or at least they did in my child's mind. They're kind of linked there. That also, and um, animals as protagonists, that were both not, they wouldn't be, Disney would not release those films, right? There's something about them that you do have real threat, real terror, um, um, real stakes, clear stakes, and haunting, and there's sadness, right? There's real sorrow. And I think just a little later, you have The Last Unicorn that was released, as well. So those three cartoons for me were, kind of imbued my sense of what fantasy could be with sorrow, right? That there's this sense that later I came across, when I'm reading in Lord of the Rings, where he captures that really well. Is there's kind of this undercurrent of sadness or sorrow,
Yeah.
that everything else is kind of playing off of and against. And so that, well, you don't necessarily get that with a lot of the Disney children films with animals as protagonists. So this was something, yeah, that was my exposure to it, was in the cartoon, and then also then later reading it as the book, and then getting more into the culture itself and just being fascinated, especially with the mythology, right? The kind of like a native, from the perspective of a rabbit's, what mythology would look
Yeah.
like from a rabbit's perspective. Fascinating. I don't know. What do you think? Yeah, about the world building that that Adams did there.
It's very recognizable on the Downs. It's very close to, it's set very close to where I actually live. And so you get an acute sense of the landscape, though his is not there's not in a mythical landscape in any sense. This is happening on the hill up behind your house sense. But it's only the beginning of a real environmental consciousness in that kind of animal fable. Because there is the sense of development moving people on, and the introduction of this mysterious illness, which we know as myxomatosis, to wipe out rabbit colonies. So I think it's extraordinary. And in a way, I think there are other fantasy series that have come on from that. They feel different, but like the Brian Jacques Red Wolf series, that's more of a heroic animal tale take. But these sort of almost operatically grand scale pieces where the animals are the heroes and taken very seriously, I think is quite a strong thread within children's fantasy, and sort of crossing over into YA fantasy as well. Yeah, so I just remembering it being in my childhood is up there with Star Wars. I think it's because I was shocked. I thought I was going to see a nice film about rabbits, and I got a kind of Rabbit Armageddon.
Yeah.
It's,
It's an
it
apocalypse,
smuggles,
right?
yeah. So yeah, I think that is exactly what fantasy should do. It should shake you up, and so I think it's a really great book. And if people haven't read it yet
Yeah,
or seen the film,
please.
I think it's well worth looking out as in the year of the rabbit. Make it the thing to watch in the year of the rabbit. Okay,
Yeah,
so
Julia, I have really quickly, I went and got the Guardian review when the book came out to see what they
okay,
said initially. And I know that it was turned down for those, again, for the interesting for everyone, but for creatives in particular, is that looking at the publication history of this book, because it is wildly different, right, from the other animal-centric books. It's hard to categorize. You can't just say that this is a quote children's book because of some of the themes that it deals with. But it was turned down from several publishers, and then finally found its way after several rejections, and then it ended up winning awards once it was published. So for those of you who are working on something, just because you receive a rejection, keep going. Doesn't mean that your work is not valuable.
yeah,
Right, it's not the final word. Right. But so the Guardian review was very positive. And this is how it started out. This is great. It said, "It simply isn't possible. At this date, 1972, you cannot write a story about rabbits, 413 pages long, and hold a reader riveted." But Richard Adams has done exactly that in Watership Down. "This is a great book establishing a more than plausible and totally fascinating psychology and physiology for its rabbits, together with their own mythology and language." So that, if I could make somebody write something like that about anything that I wrote, like, I just put that, stamp that on my tombstone, and I might as well just like crawl into the grave, because I think I'd be tickled and happy to
no, don't
if
do that just
somebody
yet.
felt that way about well, I hope not to, right? So uh this is, yeah, so
Yeah,
that like clearly this was something that for people who are looking at books and like world building, and this person understood what the author was trying to do, right? And taking the author on their own terms. And just like the world that was created there, some people didn't quite get it because it didn't fit in with how they approached. They were probably thinking about when they picked up a book were thinking Beatrix Potter,
Yeah.
or were thinking, Milne, or anything else. But this was something that was definitely new, but it had its own logic to it, right? And it was consistent, tried to be internally consistent, which is something that Tolkien, right, was
Mm.
adamant about fantasy worlds creating, as the quality of a fantasy world can be judged against its internal consistency. That was one of his right, one of his criteria in on fairy stories. So yeah, so this is something that he does really well. Just I thought that was interesting to see what at the time people thought of the book and how revolutionary really it was in terms of just storytelling with animals.
So I've come up UK based origin stories, and I'm wondering what I don't know about rabbits. I'm sure there's a lot. But Jacob, did you come up with any other own thoughts about rabbits in fantasy?
Yeah, there was Velveteen Rabbit was one I think we missed earlier. That was, and that one that's another one that's, for its simplicity, I think the theme and the subject matter there is reality itself, right? What does it mean to be real? And it's a bittersweet tale, right? Itself. So I think the tone of that one fits the film. The kind of Watership Down, where uh, it's not dealing with a rabbit as like a rabbit as an animal, as a creature. It is a stuffed, animal. It's a toy, but it's, what does it mean to be loved? What does love do to you as an individual, right? So it's in a part, I think, probably maybe you do have like I sense a little bit of allegorical maybe seasoning on it. Certainly not a one-to-one allegory, but you do have that kind of sense. For me, kind of comparing that to uh, Beatrix Potter, I feel there's a little bit more, I think, like mythic weight in the Velveteen Rabbit. Of course, in part because a fairy does appear at the end and grants the wish. So you do have fairy, the land of fairy and magic, kind of intersecting with these kind of talking toys. So in that way, it's kind of different from some of the other. So it's certainly different from Winnie the Pooh, in that you don't
Yeah.
have kind of like fairy and they don't the animals themselves don't seem to be aware that they are toys. They think that they are actual living creatures, but we're kind of
I beg your
told, the
pardon, they're not
narrator kind of
toys. They're Winnie the Pooh and friends.
they are the Winnie the Pooh
Even
friends,
though
yeah.
they get bumped on the way to bed.
Right, yeah, but yes, exactly. So this is one that I think is highlighting the distinction between the imaginary and the real world. But I do like that, right? That internally in Winnie the Pooh, you have creatures. Are they? How do they function versus how the narrator is seeing the creatures function in the
Yeah.
story? What is
Yeah, it's
their
quite good.
sense of
Yeah.
awareness?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so clever. So Velveteen Rabbit is another one, kind of from that era. But the only other ones I think kind of more contemporary, the Redwall books, that one was a kind of foundational series for me with fantasy growing up. I just really got into that series. And there aren't, yeah, you have a few rabbits there, but hares are by and far, there's hares in every book in the series, in the extensive series, but only a few
Is it?
rabbits scattered throughout.
I
Um,
fear I may have pronounced his name wrong. Is it Brian Jacks or Brian Jaques? I'm very
Brian, I
Shakespearean
always
towards
pronounce
me.
it Jacques.
Jacques.
Yeah, I know. I pronounced it Jacques, but I'm yeah, that was just how I pronounced it inside my head when I was
Okay, and so
8 years
apologies to
old.
if we've got it wrong. And also just a correction in case someone's wanting to put it in the comments. I'm S. Lewis's College's Magdalene, not
Maudlin,
Magdalene.
not Magdalene. Yeah,
As
sorry,
an
Maudlin. Yep, sorry.
old member of Magdalene, I better just say that before they chuck me out on my ear and say never
Yes, thank
darken
you,
our
thank you.
Doskin. Anyway, so going back to rabbits, any Redwall, anything else that you came up with?
There was other. Yeah, I was thinking, right. So Harry Potter has a kind of a brief reference. Hares, though, take on kind of a mythological, magical dimension there. But there is one rabbit. I was thinking, like rabbits. I know that somebody's Patronus is a rabbit, but it was so like Luna Lovegoods is a hare.
Yeah.
But Tonks, Nymphadora Tonks, is a jackrabbit.
Okay.
But that jackrabbit then transforms into a wolf. because of her love for Lupin. So it starts as like herself as kind of a shape-shifting character. Her Patronus shifts from initially being a jackrabbit, and perhaps that, I think you do see that in her character as kind of a shifting character, right? Kind of a clever, and that's where you really get, I think, in Watership Down, when they're talking about the mythology and what rabbits represent. The trickster rabbit, right? The El Herrera character, this kind of archetypal, the first rabbit, kind of that was from whom came all the world's rabbits. That kind of first mythic rabbit was meant to be smart, devious, tricky, and devoted to the well-being of his warren. So you have this idea of like that rabbits are wily trickster characters, and so I think you see that in Tonks in Harry Potter, right? This shifting, can't quite pin them down, but then she settles down when she finds Lupin and connects there with him. So that was one there. The only other ones, couple other ones. One was Usagi Yojimbo, which is a graphic novel, a comic book series, where it takes a kind of anthropomorphic animals standing in for humans at the beginning of the Edo period in Japanese history.
Interesting.
And so so he's a samurai. He's kind of, based on a famous Japanese swordsman. And where I first encountered this creature was in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the cartoon, which was one of my favorites. And so this rabbit character, when he came in, it was from a different franchise, independent comic book writer. So it didn't belong to a Marvel or DC, but one of the kind of few kind of islands of kind of independent comic publishers, as was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Was started as a comic book, then was adapted into the cartoon. But this Usagi Yojimbo was another independent comic, and so they had some crossover in the cartoon. And I remember when I saw that rabbit in the cartoon, that it was that I was stricken with how different that character seemed, and so then that introduced me into the larger world that the author Stan Sakai creates in the comic series. So it's really well done, right? And it's drama, it's action, it's serious. It's not like the Ninja Turtles cartoon that was kind of silly and bouncy. This one is much more kind of like subdued and serious in tone. So that one, so Usagi Yojimbo, and then the last one that I thought of, just kind of randomly came up, was Bugs Bunny. And I don't know if that world, if the Bugs Bunny world, Warner Brothers cartoon, if that, there's certainly fantasy type rules in that world. So Bugs Bunny as the last kind of elephant standing in plain sight but hiding in his cartoonish form, that's, I think, can technically be considered. I wouldn't necessarily, I don't usually think about that in the context of fantasy, but when I thought about it, I thought, I think you can make a case for those cartoons being fantasy storytelling as opposed to science fiction storytelling.
So
it's not realism. So
so what's going on there is the hunter and the hunted dichotomy, isn't it? Picking up on the wily aspect, and also he's a slightly cooler dude than someone like the one, and the way he's verging more towards a hare in terms of being bigger and sort of longer ears and things, sort of ears. So I think Bugs Bunny has definitely his place in the Year of the Rabbit fantasy pantheon, if we're allowed such a thing. So, Jacob, just to sort of round it all up, I mean, we always have a section where we say where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to be a rabbit. Well, I mean, sorry, we have a general theme, but today's is where to be a rabbit. Where would you choose of all the ones we've talked about?
I was wrestling with that one, because with some of these, there's such terror, especially Watership Down.
No.
That's like the Game of Thrones of world-wise, of where you would exist and what would happen there. But I thought, with the inclusion, if we do include Bugs Bunny, I would have to say the Warner Brothers cartoon world, because as a rabbit, I would never actually incur actual physical harm. Bugs Bunny is never hurt, right?
No,
It's
that's
always
true.
the hunter who is hurt. So if I could come across, come off unscathed, I think the rabbits have it off best in terms of doing things their own way. Perhaps that would be fun without the sense of impending disaster or doom that sometimes is present in some of these other rabbit tales.
Yeah, I think I'd probably be a talking rabbit in Narnia. That's where I'd go. I wouldn't get involved in this stuff going on at Cair Paravel. I just have a little house somewhere with my friends, and living the rabbit life, vegetarian, lots of kids. No, I think that would be fun.
I guess my question for you is: would you be an advocate for non-speaking rabbits in Narnia
Oh, this.
as a rabbit yourself,
Yeah, I
as a
think
sentient rabbit?
this gets me into political activism in Narnia. I think you'd have to be, wouldn't you? Because I'm not sure there's much difference between a talking rabbit and a rabbit that hasn't yet talked. We're not quite
Yeah,
we're
right.
not clear on our boundaries here. So yeah, freedom for rabbits from being hunted.
Right.
Yeah, they should all be vegans in Narnia. That would be the way to go. So and finally, I thought we should introduce a new segment to have one fantasy tip each time we're having one of our conversations, Jacob, and you can interpret that tip in whatever way you like. So do you have one tip to leave with the listeners, say?
Yeah. Just actually this past week or so, I listened to the official Rings of Power podcast. So I know we had
Oh,
a session here in the Oxford Center for Fantasy on Rings of Power, kind of evaluating it as an adaptation and as a creative act in and of itself.
yeah.
And so I'd been meaning to listen to this for a while because I knew it was official. So it's produced by Amazon. And so it's completely official. And so they interview different creators, right? They have the showrunners to talk about, their kind of philosophy for the series and what they're explaining, kind of what they're intending to do, and they do it. There's a series of 8 with a bonus 9th episode, 8 episodes, each kind of focusing on one of the different episodes of the season. So every episode they bring the showrunners on at the end to kind of give a big picture overview of kind of the themes and what's happening there in the world itself. But then they also interview somebody else, like one of the actors. They have a few different actors that they interview to get to see, what their creative process was like. Bear McCreary, who's the composer, they interview him and they talk a lot about his musical approach and comparing to the Howard Shore, the work that he did, which is the shadow that's looming over anything Lord of the Rings music related. And so it's fascinating to hear his, again, like, philosophy of music composition and explaining some of the different themes, why he does certain things to look out for. They talk about the costuming, the sets, and how different Easter eggs of different Tolkien story bits and pieces that are there in the background that I didn't notice. And so so my tip would be it's called the Rings of Power podcast on Amazon. It's produced by Wondery, is the podcast production company, which I believe is owned by Amazon. So that's
You
so
find it on normal
enriching. Whether or not you liked,
is it on just an audio, or is there visuals as well?
it's just audio.
Okay, so it'll be on podcast
Yep, it's
platforms.
just audio.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should find it. You might have to. I'm not sure if you had to listen to it. I think I couldn't find it on the regular, general podcast platforms. I listened to it on with Amazon Music, which you can get a free account for Amazon Music and then listen to it if you do. But yeah, so it was well worth, regardless of what you thought about the Rings of Power series. It's valuable in and of itself listening to for storytelling the immense amount of work and care and detail and thought that goes into making not just an adaptation, but any sort of creative world or storytelling. Fascinating, and definitely will enrich. I'm sure I'll go back and watch the first season before the second season goes out, just for consistency's sake. So my rewatching will certainly be enriched by this podcast series. So fascinating, especially from those of you who are interested in storytelling cinematically. This is something I would definitely recommend.
Thank you. That's great. I didn't know that existed. For a fantasy sort of thing this time is I sometimes struggle to find fantasy prequels or series that I actually stick with, that I get, I start, not so sure about this. And one that I will go back to, which other people have discovered, of course, is the new Netflix Wednesday, which is a follow-on from the Addams Family. Now, I just first of all would say that it's not very original in that if you just look in, there's a whole series of magic schools that are followed on from the sort of Harry Potter-esque world with the sort of Frankenstein Dracula feel. So the actual school, the Nevermore Academy, I did not find particularly new or anything like that. What I do is the characterization of Wednesday. The show creators are Alfred Gough and Miles Miller, and I heard them being interviewed on the Script Notes podcast. And one's American, one's English. Clearly very experienced creators of story. Very interesting interview to listen to about how a writer's room works, if that's something you're interested in. But I then went and watched it and thought, yeah, this is actually done very well. The story is very good. And I like the fact that Wednesday is, well, she calls herself a little psychopath. And it's quite against type for girls to be cast like that. And I like that. And there's lots of star power, very strong pacing. It's just a really good program and fun. So with the edge of a gothic horror drama. And of course, I should mention that the director is Tim Burton. So you get the Tim Burton feel. So yeah, that's my tip, is if you're looking for something to try and you haven't already noticed, the Wednesday series on Netflix is worth a look. See if it is something you like. Now, for me, have you watched this, Jacob, at all?
Yeah, I watched the first episode. I also listened. I give a hearty second to your recommendation of the Script Notes episode. I believe the title is "Any Given Wednesday" with the showrunners, and that's worth listening to. Definitely, I did watch. I watched the pilot. The one of the lead males, the normie, the normal guy. At that Wednesday ends up with the sheriff's son. Was a co-worker of my wife's at Universal Studios in Hollywood.
Right.
So we're watching it there to support him, but it is so we're working our way through that along with several other things that we're kind of weaving in and out. So
were you brought up on the Addams Family? Because for me, it's
I was the black and white. Yeah. So I watched in reruns the black and white Addams Family series. That was part of my, again, like foundational fundamental childhood was the Addams Family and the Munsters, but mostly the Addams Family. So then the films, both of the films, big fans of those films, and then now this series definitely. In the spirit of, and one of my friends helps work on the composition, the music with Danny Elfman for the music for that. So yeah, it's a great show. I'm eager to keep watching it, but like you, it was the school itself wasn't original, but in terms of some of the characterization and things that they were doing was certainly fun and interesting. I think in line with certainly kind of a spiritual successor to some of those earlier Addams Family stories. So yeah, definitely worth watching.
Yeah, and it would make a great board game, just saying. You can imagine your company coming up. So I hope one feels we have done honor to the year of the rabbit brings round, and good luck to everybody who is born this year. I'll have to look up what characteristics you're supposed to have. I was sort of expecting it to be turning into something like the year of the dragon or whatever. And when I thought it was the rabbit, I thought, oh no, that's slightly less exciting. But actually, I've really enjoyed thinking about obvious fantasy creature. So thank you very much, Jacob, for joining in this conversation with me. And we look forward to speaking to everybody next time.